It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Chamber's webinar with Israel's Minister of Science and Technology, Mr. Izhar Shay. Good morning. This webinar is being held in conjunction with ATSE, the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, and we thank the CEO, Kylie Walker, for their partnership. Kylie and myself will be asking the Minister a series of questions related to his vision and plans for his important portfolios. On today's webinar, we have people not only from Australia and Israel, but from other countries too, such as China, Cambodia, Myanmar, Taiwan, Vietnam, and a special welcome to our new friends from the UAE. The Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce, IACC, is a private, non-profit organisation dedicated to the promotion of bilateral trade and relations. We are fortunate to have 5 sister chambers in Australia located in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth. Till this year, our core business was organising delegations. And in 2020, we were expecting to host 50 trade missions. But with the new COVID-19 norm, we are now focused on technology scouting and in-country support to companies from Australia and elsewhere, helping them access the rich and vibrant Israeli high-tech ecosystem. A big part of the Chamber's work is promoting science, research cooperation, and encouraging STEM studies. These are all important topics in Australia, hence ATSE is a natural partner for this webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce Kylie Walker, CEO of ATSE. The AACC are big fans of the work ATSE does in promoting science and technology, and I'm delighted to hand over the mic to Kylie. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much to the Chamber for inviting the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering to partner on this important event. We're delighted to be here, and we're very excited about the conversation today. Before we kick off, I want to follow our tradition here in Australia of acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands from which we are meeting. I'm here in the nation's capital, Canberra, meeting you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And as we talk about our own knowledge and practices and technology, we acknowledge forever the knowledge and technology that's embedded in custodianship of country. So the Academy of Technology and Engineering is a fellowship of around 880 of Australia's top experts in applied science, engineering and technology. And it's our mission to help Australians understand and apply technology, engineering and science for the benefit of society, the economy and of course the environment. We do this in a range of ways, including setting big roadmaps and missions for the future of technology for this country in collaboration internationally as well as domestically. And we foster STEM education to develop the professional skills and engagement and interest of the next generation of STEM professionals. We have a mission to grow an engaged, diverse and skilled STEM capable workforce wherever those people end up working, whether it be in private, public or the academic sectors. We support connections internationally across a range of countries around the world, both in terms of creating joint projects and collaborations and exchanges, but also joint planning and projects and policy work, because we understand that technology, like humanity, is global. And it's important for us to continue to work with our partners and friends internationally to advance the technology, the application of and the use of technology for the benefit of the entire planet. So it's a pleasure to be here and I'm looking forward very much to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. It's now my honour to introduce the Chairman of the Chamber, Major General Izhar Shay. Izhar is a household name here in Israel, having served close to 4 decades in the IDF, starting off as a fighter jet pilot and working his way up the ranks to become head of the Air Force. Izhar has won many awards, including the USA Legion of Merit. Technology and science are very close to Izhar's heart, and his current activities include various roles with academic institutes here in Israel. It is my honor to call upon Izhar to introduce the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kylie. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to the IACC ATSE Science and Technology webinar. This is our life since the COVID-19 have penetrated our life for the last couple of months. And we are proud to be back on the net. And this is the way we have to adjust and adapt. And we're very happy and glad to have you all here. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest for today, our Minister of Science and Technology, Mr. Izhar Shay. Izhar joined politics only lately in February 2019 and became a member of the Knesset, the Blue and White Party, and he is serving as the Minister of Science and Technology since last May. But science and technology are not new to Izhar. He has served, accumulated over 30 years of experience within the Israeli high-tech ecosystem as an engineer, a manager, CEO, entrepreneur, and a venture capital investor. He was previously managing in Knan Partners investments in Israel. He was a board member with promising startup companies, some of which reached significant exit events. And prior to that, Izhar was the chairman and CEO of Secure Technologies and CEO and co-founder of Business Layers. Both companies reached a successful exit after Izhar's management. Izhar was raised and brought up in Jerusalem. He joined the Paratrooper Brigade 890, which is a firm in Israel, well known, and served as an officer, also within the First Lebanon War. And then he turned to be an engineer and began his illustrious career in the high-tech ecosystem in Israel. Izhar is also a public figure, widely known as and appreciated within the high-tech ecosystem and additional circles. He wrote popular column at Globes for 11 years, authored 2 books, founded Israel's largest digital community for entrepreneurs, which is called Startup Stadium. You're welcome to join, with about 45,000 members. Also, he founded and anchored a popular radio program, which reached tens of thousands on a weekly basis. He's not doing that right now. He's not serving as our Minister of Science and Technology. Unfortunately, he doesn't have time for that. He has time for other things. And Izhar, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being able to join us today. I can assure you, folks, that he had a very long night in the government last night, in the cabinet, since the COVID-19 situation in Israel is not very good. They're held in very long discussions. He's smiling and happy for you, but believe me, he didn't sleep at night. So Izhar, thank you so much. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Idor. So, Minister Shay, we'd be happy to learn a bit about your career prior to politics and how, as an entrepreneur and investor, you ended up as the Minister of Science and Technology.
Excellent question, Paul. First of all, let me thank you very much again for hosting me here. It is my pleasure to take this time this morning and spend it with you, with the Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce. I'm honored to be introduced by Major General Idor Nehushtan, a national hero here in Israel. Thank you for your warm welcome words, Idor. I truly appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kylie, for inviting me here. And I can assure you one thing. This is probably going to be the most exciting and joyful session of my day today here in Israel. And I'm very pleased to reopen the morning here. The night, my night stopped about an hour and a half ago. And here I am starting the morning with you. A true pleasure. And thank you again. I joined the Israeli politics, as Major General Nehushtan mentioned, a couple of years ago. And that happened after about 30 years of a high-tech career, starting as a fresh out of university, out of the Technion engineer. I started my career at Motorola Communications, and then moved on to a various of positions and capacities in various aspects of the high-tech ecosystem business. I spent about 10 years in the US running two venture-backed companies, and then moved back to Israel about 15 years ago to manage the activities of an international Silicon Valley-based venture capital firm called Canaan Partners. I was part of a team of 10 investors, most of whom are located in the east and west coast of the United States. I was the Israeli partner of the team, and we invested globally in my tenure with Canaan in, I would say, about 280 to 300 companies, about 10% of which were here in Israel. And so I think, Paul, you asked me about what brought me here. I think it's an interesting question. I found myself active in various public roles and positions in the private sector, as I always found it important to give back. I was extremely lucky throughout my career, and my attitude towards this was always, let's see who else deserves the opportunity, this wonderful opportunity of being part of the innovation ecosystem, which I got into in the early 90s here in Israel. And so I spent a lot of time, especially over the last decade, in helping entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs from sectors who are underrepresented in the Israeli high-tech economy. Those would be Haredi, i.e. Orthodox Jewish people whose participation in our economy is much lower than what would be appropriate. Arab entrepreneurs and high-tech Arab employees who, again, are not taking their rightful participation in the Israeli high-tech. And by the way, also women, interesting to note, we have advanced in terms of equal opportunities and the participation of women in the Israeli high-tech, but we're still at about 24% of participation of women in the Israeli high-tech, and that number goes lower as we move higher in the ranks in the corporate hierarchies, and definitely in the venture capital and board of directors community. So the good news is that we have advanced significantly over the last 10 years or so. I guess the better news is that we still have a big room to grow into. And I spent a lot of time on this, and also within the informal education system in Israel. I chaired an organization, by the way, the previous chairman of that organization called Tzahala, Ido was General Rampeker, who is also, or was also an Israeli Air Force hero. So there's an interesting connection over here. And that organization, which I had the privilege of chairing, deals with youth around Israel who are in most cases challenged within their social economic status. And so the idea was to provide equal opportunities, incentives, and role models for those youngsters. So after doing all of this, I realized that the opportunity within the Israeli ecosystem innovation is a significant one also in terms of closing the gaps and providing opportunities for people around the country. I almost stumbled into an opportunity of joining Benny Gantz, who is now the Minister of Defense of Israel, and about 3 years ago, a young politician going into the Israeli politics. He offered that I join his newly formed party. And I did this pretty close to just the launch of the party. 3 months later, we were campaigning fiercely and then elected, and then running again into yet another campaign and to yet another campaign. And here I am about 6 months after the last campaign of elections here in Israel, and hopefully the last for at least 2 or 3 years, who knows. I was offered the job of the Minister of Technology, of Science and Technology in the Israeli government, which was for me a dream come true. This is stuff that I love, stuff that I understand, that my background helps me figure out. And I'm in a position today to help the Israeli government figure out its strategies, its positioning within various areas. We can take this into a further discussion.
Thank you, Minister. That's fascinating. And Kylie, it's really interesting to note that on our delegations, a lot of the Australian delegates notice how a lot of successful business people, such as the Minister Izhar Shay, actually leave their business career and go into politics and to civil service. So it's great to see that tradition continuing. And also, you don't often hear ministers being so passionate about their portfolio. So that's terrific. Thank you so much. So, Minister, can you please tell us what is your vision for the Ministry of Science and Technology?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Paul. So the ministry has a number of roles. One of them is, I would call this product management. We define for the Israeli government areas of focus for the next decade and sometimes further than that. The formal role of this office is to identify trends, to identify areas of growth where the government should be participating actively. Granted, I'm coming from the private sector, so my position would be not to let the government interfere where it is unwanted or unneeded, and I keep this very strict. Nevertheless, there are areas where a government, national participation is important, either because the government wants to focus areas or to apply those strengths and maybe sometimes unfair advantages of a nation to its strategy and national strategy as well. So as an example, we are looking into quantum computing. This is not just a fund for private sectors. This is important for governments, and we see this happening around the world. We are looking at specific areas within AI, artificial intelligence, as areas of focus for the Israeli government. As a matter of fact, we are in the process of putting forward a recommendation for the Israeli government to look into a specific number of areas within AI. And another big area that we are now trying to advance on a national strategic way is the area of the new space. Israel is a worldwide force in, you could call this military space. We have satellites who cover everything we need in any proximity or any area of interest for the Israeli government and the defense forces. But the new space, the civil space, is advancing very quickly. And we have just concluded a very intensive, thorough analysis of the potential for the Israeli economy in entering big times into the new space. And so that's an example of product management, and also a good segue into another important area of my office, which is the Israeli Space Agency, which my office runs. The Israeli Space Agency is in charge of space activities, beginning from education, through setting satellites, through running all kinds of programs, scientific programs and technological programs around the space strategy for the Israeli government. And I should stress, I mainly refer to the civil aspects of the space industry. And then we have a good number of programs with important budgets allocated to them, I'm proud to say, of offering technology access and education for young people in Israel who either deserve but do not get the right or do not get the opportunities to get into various STEM programs. Very important, very close to my heart. And I'm proud to see many activities that cover tens of thousands of kids around Israel. One additional activity which is important, we are in charge of the bilateral and sometimes multilateral scientific and technology international relationships of the State of Israel. We have a few dozens of bilateral agreements with nations around the world, and my office is in charge of enhancing them, running them, managing them, and running all kinds of programs under them. And the last one is just pushing science forward. We sponsor, manage budgets, and promote hundreds of scientific projects on an annual basis to promote basic science, research, and also trying to close the gap between science, academy, and the Israeli industry.
Fantastic, Minister. So you touch a lot of topics which are very relevant to Australia, in particular quantum computing, which is something that some of the Australian institutions are world leading, and we're actually looking as a chamber what we can do to help do cooperation. And then the challenge of, as a minister, to wanting to lead yet not interfere. That's a real challenge that we empathise and support you. So, Minister, there's lots of theories on why Israel is a startup nation. What do you think are the main reasons?
You know, that's an excellent question, which so many people try to answer. I gave so many lectures around this topic, especially to delegations who came to Israel from all over the world to figure out this, you know, strange phenomena, we could call it. A very small country in terms of its geography, demography, you know, natural resources and so on, but still an international power as it relates to science and technology. You know, I believe that overall we kind of built the perfect ecosystem for innovation, which is the key for starting the business around innovation. So this ecosystem starts first and foremost with entrepreneurs, and that goes, I guess, to the Israeli culture, spirit, education, attitude, nature. You know, there are many disadvantages of what one could call our national attitude. We are not that disciplined. We do not take orders or disciplines as a very natural course of action, but that opens the way for you know, going out of your way, for breaking rules, for thinking out of the box, and also for promoting the entrepreneurial culture. You are allowed to fail in Israel. You are allowed to start a program, a startup, an initiative within your corporate. You're allowed to fail, and you will not be punished. Well, at least for the first few times. So many very successful entrepreneurs here in Israel started with 1 or 2 failures and have become dominant figures in the Israeli ecosystem, very successful entrepreneurs. And so that's important. It is also important to mention the academy. There is a strong connection, which we are still trying to improve. By the way, one of the roles of my office as well, but that bridge between the academy, and I realize that, Kylie, this may be relevant to the academy. There are many programs that started with the, you know, putting together a set of laws, of legal procedures for the academy to be able to transfer IP, intellectual property, into the industry. All the leading universities, actually all the universities in Israel have commercialization offices, companies that take IP and promote those intellectual property assets into the industry. And so there's a good connection over there, and the cooperation moves forward through all parts of the life cycle of companies here. The military background is quite important for the Israeli ecosystem, both in terms of the technological units. There are a number of you know, very unique Ivy class technology units in the Israeli army, which both educate their young engineers and scientists to think out of the box, but also educate them in a very efficient manner in terms of the latest and greatest, and give them the best tools to do what sometimes, you know, unimagined projects. And so young people grow within that ecosystem and are allowed to invent, to think very big, and are given resources that are pretty unique, and I believe that are unparalleled if you take their peers in terms of age and experience worldwide. So that's a very significant contribution. And by the way, there are other types of entrepreneurs, people like me. I did not serve in a technology unit, but I was given the discipline, the culture, the attitude of get things done, which is what you learn by serving in the Israeli Defense Forces. I should mention that we were, I don't know if lucky or capable of building an international, very strong ecosystem in Israel. We have about 300 plus international companies here on the ground in Israel. They're actively looking for talent. So they recruit our scientists and engineers, but they're also actively looking for opportunities. They invest in young startups here, they buy them sometimes, and this provides the ground for investors. This is what makes us important or attractive to the international investment community. And I would end with this. We are significantly funded by international investors. More than 90% of the investments in the Israeli high tech, to the tune of about $8 billion last year, 2019. About 90% plus are coming from outside of Israel. This is just free market investments, not regulated. The market actually, or the government actually put together a good number of policies to promote these investors. They come in, they identify opportunities, and over the last 25 years, they have been very successful in terms of providing financial returns. So that's another very significant cornerstone of the ecosystem here.
So you've mentioned a pretty broad range of approaches there, ranging from cultural elements to infrastructure to government funding and legislative levers, as well as that internationally collaborative and open, ready for business approach. And I want to draw you out a little bit more on something you mentioned quite early in this answer, which was around that fail fast mentality, that entrepreneurs are encouraged and supported to fail a couple of times and learn from those failures and then keep going. Because you'd be aware, I think there's a recent report from the World Intellectual Property Organization that says that in the future there won't be one next Silicon Valley, it'll be more like 30 next Silicon Valleys. And given that Israel is often considered to be number 2 to Silicon Valley, and you yourself have a background which will inform this directly, how do you think, in addition, perhaps, or perhaps I'm asking you about how you draw all of those different elements together to ensure that Israel maintains its competitive edge as the pretenders start rising?
Wow, that's an excellent one, Kylie. So, we grew up to become a Silicon Valley contender. So, I always looked at all kinds of charts that compared us to other hubs of innovation around the world. And the world grew flatter and bigger, and many hubs of innovation have been created over the last 20 years. But Tel Aviv and Israel maintained their position on the top 5 throughout this area of wonderful growth around the world. But we have to continue to be there. It is of national importance for the state of Israel, not only for the Silicon Wadi or Silicon Valley of Israel. So this is not only an issue of technologists and venture capital investors here. It is of national importance, and we all realize this. Just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, about 9% of the Israeli workforce are employed in high tech, but those 9%, single digit number, those 9% represent more than 50% of our exports on an annual basis. They represent probably between 25 to 30% of taxes paid in Israel, and are about 18+% of our of our GDP. So this means that they are very important. And by the way, taking this into a present perspective and a perspective that goes back to this very moment, we see the Israeli high tech as a very potential growth engine as when we get ready to get finally out of the COVID-19 major crisis. So the Israeli high tech has a national role, and so because of this, it is very important for us to keep it going and growing. And the areas we have as a government to make sure that we can do whatever the government can in order to promote. We are not going to invent, we are not going to define market trends, and not going to invent breakthrough companies. This is where the market trends check in, the entrepreneurs, the free markets, investors are going to invest, and we are going to watch. But we can make sure that the infrastructure here is one of the best and very competitive around the world for entrepreneurs who want to get their business started, for international investors who want to come in and to realize returns by funding innovation, and to international major companies which would want to place their feet on the ground here in Israel. And so the government has put forward a number of policies over the last 30 years, some of which relate to just taxation. Taxation is very, very important for international investors. And we have I should say, a pretty favorable taxation policy towards international investors. They're actually not taxed in Israel. Put in very simple words, it is a very complicated tax code. But the bottom line is that investors who participate in the Israeli ecosystem will not be taxed over here. It is very important. We keep the pace by watching international changing tax codes, and Australia being an interesting example, the UX tax code, another one, the European. And so we have to adjust to a good number of international tax codes to make sure that we always stay competitive. We want to stay competitive in terms of providing entrepreneurs a very attractive ecosystem. So just as a trivial, interesting one, the language spoken within the Israeli ecosystem is English. Paul would probably testify to this. It's interesting. I guess this will sound trivial to my audience there in Australia, but think about this. We speak and write Hebrew in this country, but you will not find mails, emails in Hebrew within the high-tech corporates. Everybody communicates with everybody in English, which makes it very easy to communicate outside of the company, to communicate with business partners, with outside investors, with people around the world, and also with people who would come in. And in recent years, we have seen a nice, interesting flow of inbound flow of both high-tech scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs and investors. Paul, I think, is a good example of this bridge between Israel and the international investment community and how attractive we want to make it here.
And I think having that access to that English is really the primary language for science and technology around the world. So it makes sense to make that the primary means of communication in that ecosystem. But I want to maybe take a slightly different perspective now, because obviously fostering an entrepreneurship culture and doing that very deliberately and using formal mechanisms to do that is one part of the equation. But another one in which Australia does often speak about and look to the Israeli example is the issue of commercialization of academic research. And you know, we have an excellent reputation and record in Australia for producing new knowledge. Our universities have very high rankings internationally. They produce incredibly high quality research across a whole range of disciplines, but we're not as advanced as we would like to be when it comes to the application of that knowledge, the commercialization and translation of that knowledge. So the lab to market part of the perspective, I suppose. Why do you think that Israel is so strong in this area specifically? You've mentioned commercialization offices at universities, but that can't be the only reason.
Well, you know, it starts with both sides of the equation. So the universities, first of all, are allowed. I'm saying allowed because the universities in Israel are heavily funded by the government. And so they require, so to speak, the permission of the government to work their intellectual property through the motions and to transfer it to the commercial business community. So that has been taken care of, and there's a good set of laws that allow the universities just to do this. Then there is the awareness, and the awareness within the academy, and I am now visiting all the campuses, all the academies in Israel, speaking with the presidents of universities, and I should say, happy to see not only the awareness, but also the motivation. So the scientists, the people who provide or are engaged with the breakthrough research projects throughout the academies in Israel are aware also of the opportunities that rely within putting a commercial aspect to those research projects. Nobody's forcing them, by the way. We have a very strong sense of the freedom of the academy. So entire scientist is not forced, neither really encouraged. They're encouraged to do whatever they want, and many of them lean themselves towards also identifying commercial aspects of their research. And so just this notion of you are allowed to do this, and you can do this, and there is a connection between the academy and the industry, only that is a good driving force within the academy. And then there is the other side of the equation, which is the industry. So the industry has learned that by really searching through and combing through the opportunities within the universities, one can find very interesting opportunities. You know, two examples that come to mind is one of the top blockbuster medicines out of Israel, Copaxone, which was licensed out of the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, a small town in Israel, a very high-end research institution, world-leading institution in terms of its areas of research. And this medicines was developed as an interesting molecule structure in Rehovot in the Weizmann Institute, and has become, through licensing, a blockbuster medicine sold around the world. And another interesting example is a company called Mobileye, which is one of the world leading companies in the area of autonomous vehicles, car safety, safety of drivers, and so on. They started by a professor in the University of Jerusalem, Professor Amnon Shashua. They became a very successful startup. They went public. They were acquired by Intel about 4 years ago as the largest exit ever here in Israel for about $16 billion. And today they employ hundreds of engineers who are the leading force around the world for autonomous vehicles. And all of this started within the academy. So the industry realizes that the potential is there. There is a free two-way conversation. And I think this leads the ground to growing the opportunities and to create a very good motivation for both sides to try to engage and create more and more opportunities.
So in Australia, we've got mechanisms like cooperative research centres, industry growth centres, research and development tax incentive. We've got Scouts, we've got government-funded venture capital. We've got a range of different government mechanisms to support and encourage this industry academic collaboration. What are the most successful government mechanisms that you can identify at the Israeli end?
I'm sorry, the last sentence was kind of...
How do you support it?
The last sentence
sorry, Minister. I'm asking how does the Israeli government support, or what are the most successful means for the Israeli government to support that industry-academia collaboration?
Thank you. So, first of all, as I mentioned, there is the laws that just allow for the transfer of intellectual property. I should mention also that there are a number of government agencies who are in charge of promoting that early stage research into commercialization. Actually, one of my office's roles is to identify early stage research ready to be reaped into commercial products and to fund those projects. So we try to identify not only pure science, basic research projects, which we fund as well. One of the things we're trying to also identify are projects which are a little bit closer to a business attractive project that would be sought after by entrepreneurs and the venture capital industry. We are actually in the process within my office of identifying an opportunity to put together venture capital funds supported by the government, promoted by the private sector, and run by joint forces of universities and the private sector investors. So to identify those kind of projects, seed them, fund them in early stages, and then push them into the market. So that's an interesting area of where the government can identify those projects. Another agency that is looking into those kind of situations is the Authority of Innovation of the Israeli government. This is an independent authority which is adjacent to the Israeli government and guided by a board of directors, which is comprised of government high-ranked officials and private sector executives as well. And the policy of this innovation authority is, in some aspects, is to identify interesting research projects which are defined as close to market in terms of their advancement, and to fund them, so to bridge the gap between the academy and the industry and provide those projects the platform for growth. This is a nice incentive for researchers, PhDs, and professors within the academy to fund the projects and to identify commercial business partners outside of the universities. And again, they do this in most cases with the help of the universities. I should say, I may have failed to mention this, but in most cases, the universities have a pretty generous allowance. Well, I shouldn't call this allowance, a generous policy towards researchers who want to participate in those business ventures. So researchers are allowed to spend a number of hours or days every week with those startup companies that have been funded based on their research. The universities have a special policy for that. They're allowed to participate in the economics of those business ventures. So there's a good two-way relationship over here, which was promoted thoughtfully, and I think helps promote the notion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister. Would be delighted to help you with this new fund you're doing with the private sector. So that's fantastic news. First I've heard of it, and best of luck in that. Can you talk a bit, before you spoke about the interfering and leading, I'd like to go a bit more deeper into that. So how would you define your role in setting the national priorities for scientific research and that fine balance of not interfering? And also if you can touch on, we spoke about failure before. A big part of our delegations is not only the VC's attitude in Israel towards failure, but also the government funding. This is taxpayers' money, and this is a very hot topic in Australia. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two.
So what do we do in terms of defining, as I call this, product management? I come from that discipline within high tech. You listen to the market, you watch carefully, you learn, you analyze, and then you make your decisions. It pretty much is applicable also to government policies. So we have a special committee. This is the National Committee for Research and Development, which is with my office by the Israeli law. This office is in charge of providing recommendations to the Israeli government, an annual report that is provided by this committee to the Israeli government. It is interesting, by the way, by the law, I, as Minister of Science and Technology, am in charge of the process of choosing, identifying, choosing, interviewing, and then nominating the head, the chairman of the Israeli National Committee for Research and Development. I'm mentioning this because it's interesting, and we are now in the process of finalizing this. So after I did my role, I bring this recommendation forward to the Israeli government. The government has to approve the nomination of this gentleman or lady. And then once the government has approved, the nomination actually is provided in a special ceremony by the Israeli president. The president of Israel, the #1 citizen in the country, is the one who gives the actual nomination to this person. And I think this is a nice symbolic process which signals to all of us how important is research and technology to the national theme, I should say. So, now that we have realized the importance, this is also the importance of the process. So once this committee is in place, the committee is engaged on an ongoing basis with identifying trends within the academy, within the industry, within the international research and technology community, providing very interesting reports on an ongoing basis, and then also formulating recommendations for the Israeli government. As I mentioned, I gave you a number of examples. We are now in the process of submitting a recommendation for artificial intelligence aspects of government involvement. We are looking into quantum computing. We are looking into space. So that's an example of how the process goes and what do we do in order to promote it. I'm sorry, Paul, the second question was?
Was just in short about the government funding, the tolerance in Israel towards failure, how you argue that with government funding and taxpayers' money.
So thank you. That's an important one because actually we have to be very careful with this. By the end of the day, this is taxpayer money that we're using in order to promote technologies. So there's a whole process within our various agencies that deal with applying those funding resources into the commercial industries, into the private sectors. There are committees that oversee the various processes and make sure that taxpayer money is used in the appropriate way. And so, for example, the government traditionally does not select the projects in terms of defining what the trend is on the commercial market, but trying to follow the market. So the Israeli government will not approach Australian entrepreneurs who stay here in Israel and tell them, this is what we want you to do, here's the money for that. It will be all the way around. The entrepreneurs or investors will approach the government and say, we have identified a food tech segment that looks interesting for us. We want to put together a new fund or a new company or a new venture that promotes food tech. And by the way, there is a big potential in the Australian market for this very specific area in food tech. We want you to consider this venture for government investment. In most cases, there is a requirement for co-investment, for matching investments. In some cases, there are additional requirements of qualifying properly to make sure that the taxpayer funding is used properly and carefully and helps promote a real business, a real commercial opportunity, which will also benefit the government and the bilateral relationships.
Thank you. Minister, I feel that we could probably talk for 2 hours, but I'm aware that we are coming towards the end of our session here. But we do have just a few more questions for you before we let you go on with your day. And thank you for being so generous with your time here. You mentioned the Israeli Space Agency earlier, and Australia is also in the midst of establishing and developing our own space industry. So I'm interested to know what the Israeli space industry is like, what stage is it at to, and are there opportunities for the two countries to cooperate in this area?
Thank you for the question, because I like this topic very much. As I said, we have concluded a very thorough analytical work and are about to submit our recommendations for the Israeli government to develop a national 10-year strategy and policies around it, so to promote the new space. By the way, interesting to note, over the last decade, this new space, which is mainly the commercial business-based space, not the military space, this space has developed very significantly because of some sort of a trivial reason, which is, listen to this, the cost of sending 1 kilogram of payload to space. So just to give you a sense, about 10 years ago, it would cost more than $100,000 to send a kilogram of something, of payload to space. Today, it costs about $2,000. So this change in magnitude of orders in terms of the cost, and by the way, think about this, the computer power that you would send 10 years ago in a kilogram of payload has increased based on the law of Moore, it's doubled itself about 5 times during this 10 years. So we are talking about an exponential growth in terms of the potential and the reduction in terms of the cost. And that's a good reason for this whole space, new space industry to develop. And so we have developed an interesting strategy. It is also based on what we have accumulated here in terms of experience of working bilaterally with nations around the world. I participated in the launch of a satellite, a research satellite built together between universities in Italy and Israel. We spent a space laboratory in this satellite, and it is handled by scientists from these two nations. We are building other satellites with other nations, some of which have been announced and some of which have not been announced yet. And we are promoting, by the way, such programs and continuously looking for international partners for these types of projects. It enhances the success potential of those projects. It enhances the relationships between the nations. It was already published that we are now having conversations with the United Emirates around maybe building such a project together. So it is important to note that this is not only a very exciting scientific project, it is not only a very exciting business project sometimes, it is also really a project that enhances bilateral relationships, puts together nations and promotes all levels of aspects of bilateral projects. People call this the Apollo effect, which is how you build a space mission, and it affects almost every aspect of day-to-day lives. It happened in America in the 60s, and we hope to see this happening in Israel. Definitely a very significant area of cooperation, potential cooperation between Australia and Israel.
Well, let us know how we can help on that. Would be happy. And of course, one of the important elements in building and growing this kind of industry is the skills pipeline. You need the workforce to come in and support it to grow over time. And that means that we're talking about education, and it's an issue I think that you and I share a passion on. It's educating children in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, not just any children, in particular children who have been marginalised or people who have been unable to access, disadvantaged kids, people in regional and rural areas who have been unable to access really high quality STEM education, and in particular gender equity in STEM education, to build that diverse pipeline going forward as well. So I'm interested to know how Israel, or how you and your ministry and how Israel more generally is dealing with the challenges of including marginalised communities in STEM education in a quality way, bridging that digital divide, and using that education as a way to address underprivilege.
Excellent one, and this is one of my beloved topics. It is important on a national level, it is important on a moral level, it is important within all aspects that one could think of, and definitely in Israel. And by the way, in Israel, there is also an economic incentive just for the ecosystem in Israel. We are lacking on an annual basis between 10 to 15,000 people who are scientists, engineers, programmers, and so on. So if we were able to fill the gap, we would enhance, again, the national GDP, the national exports, and so on. So they're all very good reasons to identify those newcomers into the ecosystem. And the only way to identify them is actually to create them. And so we are looking into various areas of incentivizing young kids into learning STEM projects and subjects, either on the formal system and also in the informal system. And there are many examples. In my office, we are engaged on an annual basis with tens of thousands of kids, either with annual programs where we provide them special courses in programming, in building, all kinds of science projects, in robotics and space. During the summer, we have special summer programs. Just to give you a sense, in this summer, obviously, we were limited in terms of the physical ability to get kids together. So we adapted our summer courses into online education. We had a 10-day program that was run very successfully in August. We announced the program in the first week of August, and within 2 days, we had more than 10,000 kids subscribing to the program from around the country. They spent more than a week within their instructors, tutors online, and they were able to engage with exciting projects. I'll just give you another one, which still excites me. Over the last 2+ years, 8 teams of students within 10, well, they grew from 10th grade to 11th and now 12th grade. So those kids over 2+ years build satellites. So we had 8 teams of kids. Each team comprised of about 10 to 20 kids. And those teams surrounded the country. Actually, there was a very good representation of what we call the periphery of Israel. We had a group from Sha'ar HaNegev, which is in the south of Israel, facing the Gaza Strip. And we had a team from Nazareth in the north, so a team of Arab kids, which participated in the same program. And I saw all these 8 teams after 2+ years of working together, facing significant challenges, and they built satellites. And those satellites, by the way, we had a ceremony about 2 weeks ago because those satellites were packed and sent over to the United States. They are going to be launched in about 2 months with a rocket built by a commercial company in the US. They will be shipped into space. The kids will be obviously very excited watching those satellites that they have built, integrated, programmed, tested, and decided what to do with them while in space. The kids are going to watch those satellites launched. Then they're going to wait eagerly to see the satellites providing the first signals from space to Earth, and then they're going to manage them, to run all kinds of experiments and so on. So think about the kid that grew up within a program like this. Think about what these kids now believes in, what this kid knows in terms of understanding that the sky is not the limit. You can go higher than the sky, you can go to space, and you can work with other kids, you can work with kids around the country, you can build multidisciplinary projects, and all of this done within your high school years. So that's just an example, exciting example of how to incentivize kids and to create for them first of all, the notion of unlimited opportunities, and also the love for STEM, for science, technology, for research, obviously for space.
Yes, I feel like we should do a weekly session with you. This is so interesting. And as the sun is setting in Canberra, we can see that on Kylie there, and you've got a cup of coffee, which I don't think is hot anymore. We've got one more question, and then we're going to ask ATSE to wrap it up. But can you talk a bit, how significant are the newly developed relations with UAE and Bahrain? And you mentioned there's a connection to space, but can you just talk about what are the relevance to your portfolios for those two countries, which we're excited about?
Well, interesting. In both agreements with Bahrain and the United Emirates, there is a specific provision in the agreement for space, technology, and science cooperation. This is, I think, one of the very significant advantages we represent here in Startup Nation. I prefer to call us Innovation Nation. So there's a strong appeal that we have always pitched and now is realizing into these very important strategic agreements on the national level. And I'm very happy and proud to see that one of the very initial cornerstones that is promoted, touted, and actually already discussed in a very practical way is the area of cooperation around research and technology. I should mention that the first historic delegation out of Israel about 3 weeks ago, we had the first formal delegation into Abu Dhabi. A very small group of highly ranked Israeli officials took the first flight ever, the El Al flight from Israel to the United Emirates. And the general manager of my office, Mrs. Shai Spiegelman, was selected. I heavily promoted her participation in the delegation, which was obviously highly sought after, but rightfully so. She was a part of the delegation. She led the discussion, the technology and science discussion in the roundtables. There was a number of roundtables that were discussed around all kinds of areas of cooperation. The roundtable of science, technology, and space was a very successful one. They had discussions about practical ways of cooperation. Actually, this week we were hoping to see a delegation coming into Israel from the United Emirates. We're going to wait a little bit longer. It will eventually come here, and we are going to look and work together on exciting projects. It's almost natural to see this developing. We see the eagerness and motivation of the private sectors in both sides. So I'm very optimistic. And I know that this is going to be successful. It is already happening.
Thank you so much. It sounds like exciting times still to come. I really appreciate the time that you've given and the time of the Chamber of Commerce as well. To give the formal vote of thanks and conclude our event today, I'm going to introduce the Vice President of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, Professor Ethan Mariels. Ethan's the Director of IBM Research Australia. He's also a Professor of Engineering at the University of Melbourne, and he's been recognised with honours internationally for his work in which he studies large-scale systems like water, electricity, and even the human brain. So to formally thank you and say goodbye, I will hand over to Ethan.
Thank you,
Kylie. And of course, he's a former chamber delegate to Israel.
Thank you, Paul. I was going to just mention that, but it's a real pleasure on behalf of everybody here, and in particular on behalf of the Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce, and also ATSE, to thank you, Minister, to give us the first hour of your day after such a long night. One thing that I'm going to take away personally is that I'm going to stop complaining about having to do a 1 o'clock in the morning with IBM in Israel. I find it amazing that you have the resilience to give us so much excitement about your portfolio and what you are doing, and so many examples of which we can learn from. When I hear quantum and AI, okay, as IBM, I think that's great. That's what you should be doing. But when I see also space, then I see all the connections with Australia coming together in a very nice way. Australia has invested a lot in quantum computing for the last 10 years, set several centers up. AI, very important aspect to go forward. And I believe after COVID-19, probably one of the engines that the economy will need to go forward with. Certainly something we're thinking about in Australia. We'd like to work with you in that space. And space, like Kylie mentioned, is one of the important things that Australia wants to do as well. And we have probably access to better launch facilities. So maybe we're able to collaborate in that space as well. I really take away your enthusiasm for the young people and the talent that you want to develop, the minorities that you're working with. There is so much we can learn from that here in Australia as well. Yeah, the way you talk about it and the entrepreneurship you have created, so many things that really resonate, and I've taken so many notes. I believe everybody here will have taken plenty of notes, and thank you so much, Mr. Shay, to bring that enthusiasm to the table and to share your rich experience with us. On behalf of all of us, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity of spending here, as I said, the first hour of my day here in Israel. Excellent questions, Kylie and Paul. Thank you for those questions. Thank you, Professor Morales, for your kind words. It has been my honor to be here in your special day. And let me congratulate all of you from here in Israel. Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and Shalom.